Welcome, my friends, to the study of the Long Scroll, Part 2, the Tzimtzum. Enjoy. Welcome to Part 2 of our study of the Long Scroll, which is the summary through a series of notes and diagrams of the fundamental structures of the system that I use for mystical contemplation. And this particular section, the second section, starts with the symbol of the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is greatly misunderstood from a non-emanationist perspective because the main purpose of the Tzimtzum for emanationist interpretations of Kabbalah is to explain the beginning of creation, the beginning of God's creation. So from a non-emanationist perspective, I don't believe in God. I don't believe that a creation took place, and I don't believe in a thing called a created universe. What I am asserting here is a meaning for reality, a meaning for phenomena that was not brought out of nothingness into a somethingness, that was not brought out of some sort of utterly transcendental state of potentia into a state of actuality. Wasn't brought from an is not into an is. From the perspective of the non-emanationist perspective, these are both conceptual designations of a rather primitive sort. To say that there is a God, which is the source of creation, and a created thing called all of the worlds and all of this that was made or created certainly at some point in time as a positive assertion of a tangible byproduct. That relies on a basic fundamental assumption of causality. There was a source for causation and a causal act, which is the creative process itself, and a causal result. What I'm saying is that causality itself, both in the aspect of its source and in the aspect of its activity and in the aspect of its byproduct, the whole thing is a conceptual fabrication to try to make sense of a primordial paradox, which is incredibly difficult to understand, but explains the nature of reality itself, from the finest point of dust specks to the grandest point of galaxies. And all of it conforms to a very basic symbol, which is summed up by the Tzimtzum. The Tzimtzum is the explanation of what happened in the beginning of creation from the perspective of Lurianic Kabbalah, which takes the symbol from the Zohar, that there's an imperceivable point, the point pulled back to the sides in this case being infinity itself, and voided or took out the essential divinity that was inherent in that field to create a vacated space, an empty circle. So you have the source emptying itself in a circle, but still surrounding the circle. And then gradually, that divinity introduced itself back into the vacated space of the circle in steps and stages. This is pretty much what you see in the diagram to the right here, that we have the essence of divinity, which is the triangle outside the circle with an aleph in it. You have the point of the circle itself, which is the aleph at the circle's periphery. And then you have a line drawing downward in concentric circles, which are the steps and stages leading to the center of the circle where you have another aleph. So if you take these three alephs as a source, a point of causation, and an ultimate destination or result of causal activity, you have an ordinary conceptual mechanical explanation of how things work that is superimposed on the primordial cosmos. How would you ever expect that to turn into a mystical understanding? The very basis of it is reductionistic and linear in the extreme. So what I'm asserting is that this same symbol, this same model, and all of its parts can change their meaning to function as a metaphor for the primordial paradox of phenomena. And the way that that happens is we take the circumstance as it seems. The whole thing is taking our circumstance as it seems and trying to get to what it really is in its essential nature. In other words, going beyond the superficial understanding of what we think things are by the way that they appear to be. The way that they appear to be in this case is that inside the circle, in all the concentric activity and the spine that designates the light for those concentric realms, we have literally everything. Everything are all the worlds that occultists are familiar with and the modes of consciousness that inhabit those worlds, which are referred to as the levels of the soul. So we have everything, all worlds, all souls. And beyond the circle itself, we have Ein Sof and the fullness of its light, which from the dualistic standpoint is like a nothingness in relation to somethingness, nothing in relation to something. But the term nothingness can be used in several different ways. It can have a dualistic designation where you have a real dichotomy between everything and nothing, or the nothingness can refer to a fullness, which is far more than a void or a vacancy, that is inherent in everything, thus equalizing the two. If you equalize everything and nothingness into a unicity, that's what I refer to as the divine. And you see it in both every apparent state of containment, what is in the circle, and in potentia, in the uncontainable ground of all things, which can't be limited or reduced to any particular form, but is inherent in all forms. That's the plenum, the overflowing light of Ein Sof, which is the primordial nothingness fullness that does the actual equalizing. I just want to make sure, Sophia, that that makes a certain amount of sense so far with you.
Yeah, well, it certainly helps that we've discussed the Tzimtzum in the past. So the way I see it, whenever we're using a symbol, it's always presumed that these symbols are referring to the way a person would approach reality from the side of, not having realized Ein Sof, right? It's so in the case of the Tzimtzum, all three of these points, the outer, the inner, and the periphery, have the Aleph. They're all part of this infinitude. They're all designating Ein Sof, and it's only from the point of view of a normal person's perception that it seems like there's this dividing line between infinity and appearance.
Right, exactly. That's why I use the Aleph for each point of the designation. It's the same Aleph.
Right.
Nothing has been separated from anything else, but it appears that the separations exist. That's the paradox.
Right. That's the paradox.
It's the same Aleph. The Aleph is the symbol for the Or Ein Sof here. And it's Ein Sof beyond containment or the appearance of containment. It's the Or Ein Sof within the states of containment. And most importantly, it's the same Aleph at the cusp, at the meeting point where the uncontainable and the seemingly contained are actually touching each other. That's the same point where the subjective knowingness of the mind and the objects that are known by the mind actually touch each other. That point is the point where magic is accomplished. That's the point where great transformation, alchemical transformation, can actually be attained. It's the point of resolution. It's the point of mitigation, between the assumption of being and non-being can be mitigated and done away with, because being versus non-being is the primary dualistic dichotomy of the habit field. How do you get over that dichotomy? How do you mitigate that dichotomy? How do you equalize the seemingly separate opposing designations that create a dualistic world? Well, you go right to the touch point, the point of resolution, the cusp of the tzimtzum, which is inherent in every moment, in every perception, in every act of perceptibility that the mind engages in. That point of resolution is always right there, right where the knowing and the known manifest. It's not elsewhere. It's the heart of the matter. It's the actual literal mystical heart of reality. Now, once that is even understood intellectually, and one begins to realize it in contemplation, it becomes what I've written here in the notes. It's a door that opens and closes. It's the Ketter point where view is either established, and I'm talking here about the mystical view. It's the point where a mystical view either takes root or fails to do so. In other words, if that point of transparency manifests and can be realized or understood or even appreciated, there's a certain openness or transparent nature that manifests through phenomena in its presentationality. The thing about the openness of Ein Sof is that it is not a distant precept apart from things as they are. It's right there. It's in the presentation of reality itself. It's in the presentational quality of phenomena. So if you see it as the heart of the matter, regardless of what the mind is doing, and not some far off aspirational precept, something way above you, which is the tendency. If you see it right there in the heart of reality, it becomes literally the transformation point between a closed state where things appear opaque and an open state where things reveal that they are indeed existentially transparent to their nature. And this is resolved right at the cusp of every circle of containment. And if you draw that circle of containment around everything that you perceive, not just the primordial tzimtzum, which includes everything, but all the details of all the rungs of the ladder, every emotion, every thought, every sense perception, every so-called assumed physical object seems to assert a barrier around itself, a limiting point. At the cusp of that limitation, of that circle of limitation, the outline, so to speak, is a door that opens and closes. Either it becomes open and completely permeable, or you slam it shut with conceptuality, and what is contained into the mode of expression becomes utterly separate from what seems uncontainable. The goal of contemplation is to do away with this barrier-making tendency. That's all it is. That's all contemplation actually is.
Yeah, and I want to hit quickly on this use of the term magic, because I think some people might get hung up on that. In the way you're using that is simply another designation for the operation of the path. When we're performing magic, so to speak, we're doing away with these klipa barriers and opening the door of Ketter to realize the transparent nature of phenomena. That's all we're doing, is we're performing the path. And that the reason that the touch point between the appearance of limitations, phenomena, thoughts and feelings, all of that stuff, conceptuality, and this idea of infinity or the Or Ein Sof is that this is the space, symbolically speaking, where you sort of step out of, you know what containment is. That's your ordinary life, and intellectually, at least, you have this idea of what infinity or openness is. And so this is the point at which you realize that the two are not separate, at this sort of barrier level where they touch, where they meet.
Yes,
And
absolutely. And I'm sorry to interrupt.
no, yeah, I was just going to say, this is why we use the symbol of the circle, right? Because it's this perfect symbol for infinity, but it also appears contained. I think you've said that before, and that's why we use it, is because it suggests both simultaneously, infinity and containment.
What you're saying is absolutely true, but even a step further, there is the possibility of magic if you can do what you just said. Because if you can open that door of presentational transparency, which is asserted in things, then you can release a tremendous amount of bound up energy, and you could literally reshape those things. So magic, even in the commonly used sense of understanding, is possible at that point. You can reshape phenomena if you could open that door and take what seems fixed and solid and contained and make it fluid and open and transparent and uncontainable. If it's uncontainable, you could do anything you want with it, because that energy that has been bound up is then freed. You could wrap it around your finger and tie it into a bow. You could literally, by virtue of the fact that the main principle of what expresses that energy, that main sense of luminosity and creative dynamism, that's one and the same as your own awareness. So if you can realize its essential nature, you have command over the awareness luminosity principle. And simply through manifesting the tendency to creatively shape that dynamism into any form that's conceivable, you manifest those forms. That's the basis of magic. So
yeah, it's not separate anyway. It would be, once you've reached that point, which is a big ask, of course, but assuming you have, it would be akin to deciding to lift your arm up, right? It's like, it's all you, so you can just will phenomena to be shaped in a certain way.
Well, there's this tendency in both theory and practice of the traditions that are derived from the kind of teaching that I'm doing to take the reductionistic take on the symbols literally. From the Kabbalistic standpoint, there are many, many Kabbalists who actually literally believe that the Tzimtzum is an explanation of the Big Bang, the beginning of creation, that the point that moved to the sides, creating a vacated space, and the reintroduction of light into the vacated space was a real proto-cosmic thing that happened, a proto-cosmic history, a real event. That's a reductionistic superimposition of ordinary habit patterns on a symbol which can mean something way beyond the perimeters of that scenario. And the same thing is true with magic. The reductionistic habit tendencies that define magic for most people designate the act as a formula, that if you have the right tools and the right names, and you could recite them in a ritual in the right order with the right colors and incenses and whatnot, then you could galvanize your will, which is simply just the ego in disguise. Sorry, folks, it just is. And you could make change happen by virtue of the fact that you've commanded the formula. But the formula is just ordinary conceptuality. It hasn't differed from the way that the mind is conventionally operating in its habitual state. Where's the break? How have you changed phenomena from the ordinary point of view at that point? You've just asserted a new formula, which is no different than, getting a map of the New York City subway system and saying, I'm going to go to Battery Park City from Midtown. And if I just follow the map correctly and get on the subject and, the magical incantation of exchanging the money for the card and putting it in the thing, it's like a mechanical process. It's just a mechanical process, right?
Yeah, right. Yeah,
it's the same as making your dinner.
It's ordinary activity with extra steps and a few layers of theatricality laid on top.
Well, that's the thing. The theatricality is generally a theater of self-esteem and identity. That's thrown in.
Yeah, that part is definitely going to get us some hate mail, but right. No, I think that's kind of an important point to make, just as a quick aside. So many people are drawn to practices like this, or think that they are, to magical systems or spiritual systems, because they have some sort of psychological healing to do. And I'm not invalidating that. I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to be dismissive of somebody's pain or struggle or anything, but a spiritual system is not therapy. It's not there to give you an identity and to make you feel a certain way. That's not its function.
Well, I couldn't agree more. And the good news is actually that I'm affirming the basis of what these people are saying that they want to do. Magic is eminently possible. It is absolutely possible in terms of the manipulation of phenomena, which is what they're interested in. Yes, that is possible, but not in the way that it is generally conceived of, the way that it is purported to be in formulaic terms in post Golden Dawn style magic and in the grimoires leads to a series of misleading assumptions. If you change those assumptions and change the meaning of phenomena itself, yes, that sort of transmutation is possible. That's good news for people who are interested in that subject. So I am not saying that magic at its root is self-esteem theater. I'm saying the self-esteem theater is the unfortunate byproduct, which can be dismissed to get to the actual practice of what is promised there.
Right. Yeah, definitely. So I think that's a good distinction to make. And getting back to the subject of the Simsum, it occurs to me that you could, or rather, could you think of it as a continual process that's always happening? It's a symbol for something that is always going on because it represents the appearance of phenomena per se.
Bingo. Yes.
Yeah.
There is no question that what you're saying is the pith of what I'm talking about. Because if you're reducing it to a protocosmic history, you're placing it in time as an event that happened in the primordial past, right? So obviously we're not talking about that. If I'm saying that the Simsum itself is a symbol or a metaphor for the paradox of phenomena, the paradox of phenomena is not time bound. It's always. It asserts itself always equally. There is no past or present or future in relation to the paradox of phenomena. That is just simply reality itself. So yes, in that sense, it is always happening. It is always presenting itself.
It's the paradox of the uncontainable presented as contained and separate.
Yes, it seems that there is a potency in the universe that is uncontainable. We can call this the magical quality of the divine, but then it appears that human beings fixate on things that seem contained. So what's a person to do? Because it seems that there's this dualistic dichotomy between the seemingly contained things of my life, including my emotional states and thoughts, and this notion of the divine, which is utterly beyond me. Well, what I'm saying is that there is a continuum where those two polarities lose themselves through each other. and nullify themselves to each other. And a secret ingredient is discovered at their meeting point. There's a secret ingredient discovery that happens as the uncontainable and the contained supernova with each other. And that's literally the cusp of the point of limitation that surrounds every seemingly defined finite thing. That's where the infinite is actually discovered, in the skin of the finite. And the skin of the finite is the skin of all appearance. And when I use the term appearance, I'm not just talking about what visibly appears. I'm talking about what is felt and heard and tasted and touched and known even conceptually, that the skin of a thought asserts this magical point. The heart is carried by the skin. And the reason why in my system, and we'll get to this in detail later on, the reason why the heart of the matter cannot be relegated to any one particular sphera. It is not necessarily just Ketter or just Ferret or just Malkut. It's the synergy of all of them. It's the distillation of the entire middle pillar. That is what the heart is. The heart is irreducible. It's irreducibility itself. It's what I will call later on black ether. And I'll define that probably in the third or fourth section. Mm-hmm. But like I said, I am using all of the symbol system of what other people use dualistically and changing the meaning. I'm not here to discard the basic tenets of what people are already doing. They have all the tools symbolically at their disposal already. But in Kabbalah, we have a lot of literalistic and reductionistic tendencies, especially in the Lurianic system, especially where the Tzimtzum is concerned. And if we really want to get deeper into how the Tzimtzum circle and the elements of this diagram that I put up on the screen can function without dividing causes from effects, in other words, to mitigate the causality that creates dualistic divisions, we got to look deep within the symbols, even in the way that the Lurianic Kabbalists speak about them. And down at the bottom of the page, I have a set of symbols that are used to describe phases of the Tzimtzum in Lurianic Kabbalah that are taken very literally as events in cosmic history by Kabbalistic literalists. These are the phases of the Tzimtzum where, as the Zohar says, worlds were created and destroyed, because the larger study of the Tzimtzum literature is much more than the gross oversimplification of what I've stated already. It involves an extremely complex network of attempts to make reality, where reality was made purposefully, incorrectly, and then shattered, so that the shattering of the pieces of a reality that didn't work became hidden sparks throughout the vacated space and inherent in all the worlds. It's an attempt to explain how there are sparks of non-duality within dualistic assertions, which is really a very beautiful idea once you get over the fact that this is describing something mechanically. So what I've done is I've taken the three basic divisions of the proto-cosmic history, and I've taken them out of the Lurianic system because they're just really good explanations of what is realized in the contemplative process as you discover the ground. So please, nobody tell me, oh, you're misinterpreting Lurianic Kabbalah. Yeah, I know. I'm taking the symbols and using them differently, right? So I'm not trying to do a Lurianic teaching here, even though I'm using Lurianic terms. I am rehabilitating these symbols from what is ordinarily an overly complex emanationist system. And I'm bringing it into a non-emanationist view. So we have three models of reality. We're looking at the bottom of my notes here on the right-hand side. Three models of reality that we could say perfectly explain what the mind goes through as it slowly realizes and discovers the ground. And it starts with the Berudim, and then goes to the Nekudim, and then goes to the Akudim. These are the phases of what is generally referred to in Lurianic Kabbalah as the shattering of the vessels. That we start with the Akudim, where the attempt was made to manifest all the Sfirot in a singularity. But a singularity it lacks the capacity for apparent interaction. In other words, what is needed within the singularity is the illusion that there are dualistic exchanges in order to manifest variables. In order to manifest infinite variability, we need the illusion of duality. In other words, duality has a function. It's to manifest the limitlessness of phenomena in the fullness of its expression. And that's, of course, what it is. If we understand that and understand that nothing dualistic was ever separated or reified or made or created, but yet just merely expresses the essential fullness of the continuum that is always open, then we have our view. But from the standpoint of the Akudim, if all the Sfirot were one single Sphira, like one single Ketter, it would be inconceivable that a world could be created. It would be a monad. It would be a reified singularity. So that singularity would have to be ultimately discarded. And as the Zohar says, worlds were created and destroyed in the making of our world. It's an explanation. It's a myth. What comes out of this is the phase known as the Nekudim. The Nekudim takes the idea of the Akudim, of a singularity, but puts it in the form of the Sfirot. In other words, every Sphira becomes a monad in and of itself, right? Becomes the ultimate destination. And as that happens, we have a paradox. We have a set of monads. A monad is everything. It's a singularity, right? So how could you have a set of monads? Well, what happens is, in the contradiction created by the individual vessels that take everything and don't pass it on in a relationship, they break and shatter. So we have literally the shattering of the vessels of the Sfirot in this dimension of the Nekudim that become what is known in Kabbalah as the world of points. The points are monads. After the shattering of the Nekudim and the world of points, we have relative relationships constructed within the tree of life where luminosity can be passed from Ketter to Chokhmah to Bina to Chesed, right? And all the interactions between all the Spherots are shared with each other because no Sphira acts as a monad. This is the symbol, right? In a slightly modified, simplified form. What I'm saying is that you could look at these three so-called primordial stages as a description of what happens in contemplation as one cultivates realization. First, we deal with the Berudim, relative relationships. We deal with parts as we're trying to discover their commonality. We deal with a world of seemingly separate things in relationship between themselves and each other. We have no choice. That's the starting point. But what happens once we go so deep within these relationships that what is discovered cannot be described or summed up or limited by how the relationships seem to function, we go beyond relative functionality, right? Because in relative functionality, you always have a subject and an object. You always have a so-called objectivity that is discovered by a so-called subjectivity. And that's the basis of relationship itself, a knower and a thing known. And then a relationship between the things and the points of view, and on and on and on until infinity. What happens when you crack open that construct which accounts for all of relative life? In other words, when you transcend the laws of physics and human psychology and the conceptual laws of what is real and what is not real, what happens when you go beyond the rules of the game? Well, you enter into the world of points. And this is a real mystical phenomena that happens to a person, where essentially the field of reality is reduced to scintillation. Scintillation is a mystical phenomena that I could talk about, but I'm not really sure if it will make a great deal of sense to anyone. When one enters into the phase of scintillation, or the world of points, which is literally the world of points that Kabbalah describes, every point that the mind would seek to designate in time or in space or in conceptuality or in some kind of quality becomes itself an assertion of wholeness. But just like the paradox said with the Nekudim, how could you have pieces of wholeness? If wholeness is whole, it's everything. So if wholeness is whole and it's everything, it can't be a piece. So what happens in this dimension of scintillation is that you have wholeness asserting itself in infinite vectors of expression, which appears, and I'm stating from the standpoint of the body mind here, a field of sparkling monads beyond size and location and temporal designation. In other words, wholeness sparkling through the interactive relative relationships of what appears to be. And in this moment of scintillation in the world of points, the light asserted by the point, the sparkling light, is itself both knowing and that which is known colliding with each other into literally a supernova, literally colliding to the point where both the designation of what is known and what is knowing disappear through each other. And at this point in contemplative discovery, this scintillation becomes so profound that if it occurs in its purest form, one can literally pass out into unconsciousness. And my experience with this, when I've discussed it with my teacher, is he gave it a really interesting term. It is essentially bliss. It is a form of bliss, but it is a form of bliss that is profoundly uncomfortable. So it's not ecstasy. It's the definition, it's the difference between bliss and ecstasy. And in the form of bliss that we're talking about, which is more than the body can withstand, so it doesn't feel good, but it doesn't feel bad. It involves tremendous amount of heat and pressure. And what is released is a fluid scintillation of a barrage of a field of essentially scintillation, which utterly subsumes you. And when the mind is overwhelmed, it checks out. So I said to my teacher, this makes me feel like I'm going to pass out. I'm going to black out. And he said this amazing thing. I'll never forget it. He said, no, you're going to black in. He said, you're not having a blackout. You're having a black in.
Yeah, that's pretty great.
Because it's the dark luminosity, essentially, asserting itself.
Right.
The direct apprehension of Chokhmah and Bina.
I mean, that's absolutely beautiful. And I would step in here just to see if I understand this properly and maybe approach it with some different language. It seems to me that this process, the reason that there appears to be this tension between, this sort of sparkling through of this scintillating presence of the monad or the Ein Sof and everything else. I mean, the fact that it's there's a resistance point is that you as a body mind with your collection of habits of reification and conceptuality and designations of the world, the conventional model of the world as most people know it, is bumping up against what actually is, right? The Ein Sof and the ground, and they're not. It's this sort of turgid, I don't want to say mess, but it's this field of resistance between the two of them, and that's why there's this discomfort, right? Because on the one hand, you've got the endless light pouring in, but you're still a being that is desperately grasping and holding on to your conventional designations, and want to let them go. And so that's why there's still this on-off scintillating world that you're bumping into.
Yes, that you're absolutely correct. And this is amazingly why the world of points, or the Nekudim, is associated with what's called the shattering of the vessels, because your world is literally shattering. Literally, you are meeting that point of resistance at the root for the resistance of everything, all the types of resistance that constitute your habits, all of them, whatever these resistances are that create the individual parts of your habit field, they're all being challenged at the root. And if that challenge is made powerfully, intensely, and authentically, you collide against it. That's why I use the term supernova, because literally that collision is where the old worldview will shatter into a million sparks. And these are literally the sparks that constitute what will be the monad of clear light in the next phase of contemplation that corresponds with the Akudim, because it's there that the reification itself is challenged. See, in the world of points, you're not truly challenging the root of reification. You're just challenging the habit field enough that you confront the barrage of resistances. Beyond that is the challenge to the root itself, the challenge to the monad itself, because that's the monad of Ketter that is brought into question, that either opens or closes, like I've said before. And the interesting thing about that point is that when you challenge the Ketter point, the monad of clear light, you are challenging the assertion of Moses standing at the burning bush, where Moses said to, I almost called Moses monist. That's pretty funny. Only to certain people, though. Moses at the burning bush says to the voice of God, who shall I say sent me? And the answer is, Ehya Asher Ehya, I am that I am, or I will be that I will be. In other words, the assertion of God as an I am is what we will give the human realm to conceptualize a theistic point of origin or a divine source. But that is not truth. Truth is not the I am. The I am is reification, the reification of knowingness itself, or the reification of light itself, or the reification of possibility itself. So the I am is the klipa of the monad, the klipa of Ketter. Because essentially at the burning bush, what is being presented from God is a giant ego. That Moses, the self-identified ego, is asking, what or who shall I say sent me? And the response is a giant ego that includes everything else. And we'll call it God.
The ultimate. Yeah.
Right.
Right. Well, yeah. So it seems like here we're describing this process of raising the sparks. And after that point, you're still left with this hurdle of undoing the great mistake, which happens at Ketter, of either opening the door or closing the door. So Ketter is, you can either continue making that fundamental primordial mistake of assigning an I am egoic identity to the so-called monad of Ketter or God or whatever you want to call it, or you can, unmake even that. And that's kind of this next step toward gnosis, right? And is undoing that mistake and transmuting Ketter into this clear light open door. And I want to point out too that when you talk about heat and pressure, that it seems to me, and we've talked about this before, where you've discussed being in these states of creating this high pressure heat situation in your practice, and you've described that as a precursor to a kind of a breaking through to the next level, right? So so I think of the alchemical process as being one where you're constantly engaging in this undulating process of building up pressure, breaking through, building up pressure, and so on and so forth. And that's this sort of necessary byproduct of unmaking your habit field. And this is why we talk about it in terms of vessels and shattering and a melting the mercury salts and that kind of thing.
Yes. Yes, I'm going to go into detail in sections of the long scroll that articulate exactly what you're saying now, right? To like pinpoint detail. There's a lot to be described in the language of the Sphirot, but essentially what you are describing is how one works with the agencies of the sun and moon interactively as one struggles to mitigate the tendencies or habits of dualizing these agencies, right? The sun and the moon are a singularity, but our habit is to see them as opposing forces. So
Right.
How do you work that? Well, you work it by taking the powers of the sun, which become heat and pressure, the sulfur force, and the fluidity of adaptation that carries the ground into its activity, which is the power of the moon, that's Mercury. So essentially, the heat and pressure that you're talking about is the rising life force, which is sulfurous in nature. And once the limiting shells that we will describe in future pages of this long scroll, once they are melted through, and I'll explain what I mean by that, what is liberated are greater and more subtle degrees of mercury than we currently have. And that mercury starts to flow out of the resistances once we melt through them. And once we liberate greater degrees of mercury, we go into a register of mercury that is totally beyond the habit field. We call that secret mercury. And once secret mercury starts to pour in, and the source of all secret mercury is derived at the point of Ketter. So everything that you're saying, we're going to go into extreme detail. But before we leave this Berudim, Nekudim, and Akudim stage composite, I want to talk about what happens at the point of Ketter once what is closed starts to open. And Lurianic Kabbalah gives us a marvelous symbol for this as well. It's in the Adrot section of the Zohar, commented on in many Lurianic commentaries. And the symbol is known as the three heads of Ketter, or the three phases of Ketter's opening from the contemplative standpoint. And in ascending order, it starts with what is called the infinite head, moves into the phase called the head of Ein, or the head of nothingness. And then beyond that moves into a phase which is just called the unknowable head. I call it the headless head. So once we move from relative relationships, the Berudim, and meet our resistances head on profoundly in this shattering of the vessel's experience of the world of points, and it's no foregone conclusion that strong reality shattering experiences of scintillation will necessarily lead to the root monad at Ketter of the Akudim. It's not a foregone conclusion. There's tremendous amount of work to do, even past that very advanced point, which is, maybe a subject for another time. But if one does pass through reality in its conventional form, having shattered and cracked open, and one manages to find the root of beingness itself, which is the root of being and non-being, right? That's where the monad is either reified. That's where reification is made or unmade. In that moment of the Nekudim, you're actually in the work of Ketter itself, which is symbolically expressed by these three heads. The Nekudim are the three heads of Ketter, essentially, in terms of contemplation. Now, again, for those people who are hearing me, this is a little different than what you're used to hearing in Lurianic Kabbalah. I am using the symbols differently. I hold a different view. I'm not merely parroting the words of the Etz Chaim and Meyer Popper and Chaim Vital. I'm doing something else. I'm holding a non-dual view. So get used to it. So on the level that we confront the monad of clear light, we have an aspect of Ketter which is called the infinite head. It's a unicity, but it's a reified unicity. It is infinity, but it's infinity realized as a reification. So that's the lowest level of Ketter. You're at the root, but you have the habit of reification and you're applying it to the root. It's still an extremely high state and a very rare state and a state that almost nobody realizes, but you can't go any further unless you come up against it. You are realizing the infinite, but you're reifying it still. It's the most subtle aspect of reification. If you mitigate it at this point and can pass through this point, you've penetrated the klipa of Ketter, which is an incredible, marvelous thing. And once you go beyond that point in Ketter, you reach the head of Ein, the head of nothingness. In other words, you realize that the monad is open. The unicity is an openness. This is literally the point where true apophatic immersion allows Chokhmah and Bina to function for what they really are. We see, this is where people take the ladder system too literally. They think, oh, if you're in Ketter, then you're above Chokhmah and Bina. Not true. Chokhmah and Bina are always functioning, just like all the Sfirot are always functioning. But we're changing their meaning at Ketter. If the apophatic link in the aspect of Ketter that becomes the head of nothingness truly opens, then Chokhmah and Bina become literally dark luminosity and luminous darkness. In other words, a dynamic openness that can literally become any appearance and never be reified. In other words, what we're talking about with the dark luminosity and the luminous darkness of Chokhmah and Bina is the assertion of secret Mercury in its purest form. So at the head of nothingness, this is realized. This is an incredibly rare and powerfully transformative part of Ketter's opening. But it's not even the ultimate. There's a stage beyond this. Now, keep in mind what I just described is the apophatic link. This is the point where awareness falls through the expression of its own light, that the mind actually falls through itself. The mind falls through itself. This is so much deeper than merely just experiencing the bliss of scintillation, right?
Silence passing through itself.
Can you repeat that?
Silence passing through itself.
Yes, silence, but silence in this case is bright.
Yeah.
Right. So if you imagine, it's like the introduction of that bright silence in the scintillation shattering experience is like the calling card for the apophatic immersion. The scintillation is not the true apophatic immersion. It's just the indication that the possibility is there. Past that point of scintillation, we fall through the monad of clear light, through the Nekudim, into Ketter itself. And Ketter is confronted and either opened or not opened. And at the point where, like you said, silence falls through itself, the apophatic link becomes viable.
So does this bear any relation to the Shashmal that you've talked about previously?
The aspect of Chashmal means speaking silence, and what it is essentially the brilliant darkness of the secret Mercury, which is the Chokmah aspect. If Chokmah performs expressively with no reification imposed upon it, that expression is secret Mercury, is Chashmal. Chashmal is simply the unveiling of the dynamism of Chokmah. So by virtue of the fact that we fall through Ketter, we fall through the head of nothingness into the apophatic state, reality, as it always asserts itself, will assert itself. But in a post-apophatic manner, see, in a post-apophatic manner, the creative surge, the creative thrust becomes Chashmal, becomes the voice of silence, the wisdom nature speaking. And it speaks as everything. That's the currency of realization. So yes, we're talking about that becoming realized and known, but it's known by virtue of unknowing something. It's post-apophatic.
So at this point, the practitioner is not having an experience. They themselves have sort of nullified and ceased to be, which is the same as saying they've become one with this clear light. That's the only way to know it. And that's kind of a misnomer, because we're at this headless head, unknowable head place where you've essentially merged with the clear light. So there's no you to experience anything anymore.
Well, we have to address what we mean when we use a term like experience. And experience in the conventional sense definitely applies to a knowing subject knowing some object of phenomena, even if that phenomena is itself, right? If I become my own object by virtue of Descartes' assertion, I think, therefore I am. What is being known is the I am, but what knows it is the I am, right? So they get horribly confused within each other. But there is most definitely a subject, which is the means to know, and something that is known, some phenomena. In the case of I think, therefore I am, it's my own thoughts and my own perceptions, right? So if there is an experience, even of myself within my own mind, there is a subject aspect and there is an object aspect. That's what we conventionally call experience. So what Descartes is talking about is the discovery of experience. I disagree with his conclusion that he can verify. I mean, there are all sorts of ontological and epistemological implications in his statement, and I reject them because he's not interested in the essential nature of phenomena. He's interested in a set of self-verifying conclusions. That's a philosophical question for somebody else. But yes, experience, dualistic experience, which implies a subject and an object, is cultivated in the phase of the Berudim, shatters and cracks open in the phase of scintillation of the Nekudim, and one falls through the monad of clear light in the phase of the Akudim, and that's where it really stops becoming conventional experience, in the phase of the Akudim, which is where Ketter is introduced. But then you have to deal with the reification that makes experience. So the infinite head is when you confront the tendency of reification prior to experience. So it's not even experience at that point, but there's still reification prior to experience that has to be dealt with. So you could say that everything until this point is cataphatic. And the next phase is when you take the real step through the head of nothingness into the unmaking of reification itself at the root, which is the apophatic link. So beyond that is the free fall, is literally what happens as you pass through the apophatic link into what the Zohar calls the unknowable head, or the headless head. And that is the apophatic door that was opened in the head of nothingness. One then passes through it. And the way that I will talk about this in the long scroll goes way beyond the Zohar's description. It talks about essentially falling through Ketter into the ground itself. And if that's understood the way that I'm asserting it, we could say that really two things are possible here. There's a falling up outside of the making of things that occurs, literally a falling up, which is a bizarre metaphor. But then there's also the simultaneous falling back down, because you're not leaving the world. The world is just changing its meaning. So there's a simultaneity of these two gestures. There isn't a mechanical process where you fall into the apophatic state. Okay, I'm going into the apophatic state. I'm going somewhere, which would be an experience, of course. And now I'm coming back. That doesn't happen. That doesn't exist. That's imposing a set of self-identified experiential conclusions on what happens. It happens outside time, completely. So in the moment that one falls into the apophatic embrace, there's simultaneously the reassertion of phenomena in a completely reborn form. So the falling up or out of experience and the falling back into experience happen spontaneously at the same time, at the same point, without any division between them whatsoever. And this is going to be very, very difficult for people to understand, because there's no time, there's no dimension, there's no reification, there's no identity. There is nothing there to describe an experience or a set of conditions. There is nothing to describe anything happening. So what can you say about such a thing? Well, you can't say anything, but you can assert a symbol, the unknowable head of the divine, the headless head. And what I'm going to describe in future sections of the long scroll is how the point, which is the step-off point to Ketter and ultimately to the headless head, is dot. And the term that I use for dot is the false head. So you have the false head giving itself ultimately to the headless head. And that changes the dynamic of the tree entirely. You got any comment on that?
Yeah, I will just want to point out what you've written here about Dot. Dot surrenders to Ketter. Ketter accepts sacrifice, and Soph usurps Ketter. So it sounds like those were your notes of the description of what you just spoke about there, that the false head goes away, it becomes sacrificed. It's this passing through point to where we get to the real Ketter, the open Ketter, which is the gateway point for Ein Sof.
Yeah, you could say that these 3 points relate to Beredim, Nekudim, and Akudim, that on the level of the Beredim in relative relationships, you have life force being cultivated to the point of dot, where dot is capable of surrendering to Ketter. And in that surrender, dot meets Ketter, and Ketter touches dot and accepts the sacrifice. And that becomes the world-shattering scintillation of the world of points. But past that, the trajectory goes through the open door of Ketter into Ein Sof, which usurps Ketter. And that's really, see, the beginning of the apophatic process happens in Bina. But ultimately, Bina becomes an open door through the wisdom nature of Chokmah to the root itself, which opens into infinity. So ultimately, the apophatic immersion is into Ein Sof. But but we have to make these distinctions, because there are various subtleties that definitely manifest and are realized in contemplation, where it's not so easy. You know, there's a lot of facets and phases where the impulse to reification becomes extremely subtle. And we see it certainly in the reification of the clear light. That's the infinite head of the unicity. And then the point where the infinite head starts to open, but it doesn't open mechanically or directly. And sometimes it takes years of seepage through the fabric of reality, where one falls through a little bit at a time, where the capacity to fall through is incomplete, I should say. But in the ground, just as we've spoken of these transitions in terms of threefold divisions, right? You know, Ekudim, Nekudim, Berodim, and the three heads of Ketter, you could also talk about the ground itself in a threefold way. And that's what I've written here, that starting from the top and going down, that the basic essence of the ground is the openness nothingness, which is absolutely full. That's the plenum. If you understand the plenum as an openness nothingness, you understand that it's not a void or a vacancy. It's open by virtue of the fact that it is so full that it is irreducible to any quality or constraint. Based on that fullness, the plenum is realized as brilliant, and the openness is realized as a fullness which is luminous, which shines, which can't not shine. You will never find these aspects separate from each other. This is only a distinction that we can study and contemplate and realize in meditation. The actual function of the ground will never just be open without brightness. You'll never be able to separate the two. They're one and the same. This is why it's a non-emanationist system. This is why it's so difficult for people to study this stuff. Because the philosophy, by virtue of the fact that it is language, is a lie. But it's a lie that's true.
Yeah, that's something, isn't it? And so is this why in the diagram of the Simsum you have there, the Aleph that's outside of the circle is encased in a triangle?
Yes, yes,
yeah.
That's why. Oh, yes, thank you. Yes, that's exactly why. Yeah, and if you think about it, not only is that Aleph encased in a triangle, but there's three Alephs that make up the diagram. So everything is three.
Yeah, right. Yeah, there's this nice unifying triplicity. And just to comment on what you said a minute ago about this tendency toward the emanationist view and how strong it is, I think, you know, it definitely took me a minute to wrap my head around the fact that even something as simple as a reliance on objects in space and events in time, the five dissolutions that you've spoken about in previous videos in the 32 keys cycle, the tendency toward experiencing time, dimensionality in space, conceptuality, what is substantiality, and this idea of is or is not beingness versus non-beingness.
Right, the root.
At the root, yeah, that we're constantly up against this, this Herculean task of reminding ourselves that these things are not real, that these are exactly the hurdles that we're trying to get over. But we have this great challenge that that language itself pivots around these designations. It's so difficult to get away from them and still have a conversation about the goal of the path and the ground, because everything keeps, it's like it keeps dragging you back down into this conceptual habit field, even though the way you're thinking and talking about it.
I'm really glad that you said it that way, because here at this point in my notes, where I'm going from a description of the plenum to a description of its brilliance, we're talking about the ground. right? But the third part that I've listed here is the resonance of the brilliance of the plenum, the resonance field, which is an infinite vibratory set of possibilities where the possibilizing potency of the brilliance expresses itself as any and all types of energy. Now, as we know, the symbol for a vibration of this possibilizing potency can be expressed as a waveform, right? An oscillating up and down waveform. That is the symbol of the serpent, right? And this is how the symbol of the serpent, in particular, the serpent in the Garden of Eden, which is the Gnostic scenario question presented in symbolic, metaphoric form, for all Kabbalists, both Jews and Christians. It's called the Nachash. The Nachash is the vibratory waveform of possibilizing potency. So if we're studying this threefold take on the ground where the plenum expresses its brilliance and its brilliance resonates into infinite possible vibratory modes of expression, those modes of expression assert lies that are true, just like you just said. They assert phenomena which the mind has a tendency to grasp and utterly interpret wrongly or incorrectly. But yet you are free to interpret them wrongly based on your tendencies and habits, and there will be no correction. But at the same time, if you internalize a Gnostic trajectory which seeks to correct the error that you have made, that is possible in that moment to an unlimited extent just as well. So there is no inhibition inherently in phenomena that pushes you either to get it right or get it wrong, other than the momentum of your own habits themselves. And this is why the assertion of the vibratory resonance field, the Nachash, the serpent, is such a problematic symbol and character in the Bible, because this is the subliming toxin. This is the poison that is its own medicine. It could bear the toxicity of the mercury, which is the utter reductionistic collapse of all of your habits into reification. That's the toxin. But in the same instance of the assertion of the toxin, realizing its essential nature transforms its toxicity into a medicine for its own disease. So the words of the Nachash in the Garden of Eden, you eat the fruit of the tree, you'll be as gods. That's not a lie. But it's also not exactly true when spoken to somebody whose habits utterly overwhelm them. So the aspect of the vibratory resonance field, that's everything in the tree. So we're not talking about the ground above Ketter as some sort of faraway precept at that point. We're talking about how what is discovered when one falls through Ketter utterly changes the meaning of everything, which means Malkut. Because what we're changing here is Malkut. We're ultimately realizing the equalization of Malkut and Ketter as Ketter opens. So there is no division or distinction between them whatsoever. And when Ketter and Malkut are held as one and the same, that's the heart of the matter. That's literally where the philosopher's stone coalesces in the heart. And that can only be realized through the point of black ether, the unmaking of reification in each circumstance. And we'll get to that. We're getting to all of what I'm implying here in future sections of the long scroll.
So, yeah, real quick, would you say that this this realizing of Ketter and Malkut as one and the same, does that bear any relation to this symbol of the tree of life that sometimes gets passed off as Metatron's cube, right, where it's sort of collapsed and there's no dot and it's this perfect symmetrical geometry?
Yeah, I've seen that diagram. I don't know what the hell that is. No, I don't have anything to say about that diagram. It's not part of my system.
All right. Well, I just thought I would ask.
Yeah, but I should say that the equalization of Ketter and Malkut is again going back to the symbol of the Ouroboros, of the circle that's eating its own tail, and this is what is described in the Sefer Yetzirah. And unless I am going to misquote it, what it says is the end is embedded in the beginning, and the beginning is embedded in its end.
Right.
You know, and that is literally the unmaking of causality. And what is realized in contemplation is not only the unmaking of causality, which would be happen in the world of points, but is unmaking the impulse to causality at the root, which is reification. Reification is what makes causality. So when that is dealt with in Ketter, you are attacking the problem of the toxin at the root and transforming it into a medicine. That's the highest alchemy.
Right. Yeah. I love that metaphor because this ties back into what we were saying a minute ago about how if we're going to have a conversation about the path and about the ground and the goal of the path, then we necessarily have to use language, but we're sort of sidestepping the habitual use of language and conceptuality to sort of trick the mind and point outside of itself. And so we're using this poison, this toxin of conceptual reification and the habit field, the habit of reification, and using it to subvert itself, to become the medicine for its own toxicity.
Yeah, this is where we have to draw a distinction between the preliminary study that's necessary in contemplation, which we're doing here, and the actual practice of contemplation, which is something that all of this leads up to. The thing that ultimately happens when one digests this study and follows the points that I'm making is that for those who are so inclined to take to this system, there is no artificial set of practices that need to be instituted. Simply by studying and digesting these points, you should be led by the hand to want to change what the mind is doing. And at that point, the direct assertion of perceiving, the direct assertion of perceptivity can change because you're looking at it differently. Now there is a practice, and I will address it much later. And we'll talk about practice at a later point. So I'm not going to leave people hanging. But before even the suggestion of practice is brought up, there are certain things we need to get clear, certain things that we need to get straight. And it's impossible to think of yourself as a contemplative and not consider these issues. What is reality? What is a thing? What is the knowing of a thing? What knows it? What is its nature? Right? What is the nature that is shared between what knows and what is known? Unless you address these questions, and you're going to need a symbol system to address these questions, because just inquiring into those questions philosophically won't lead you to anywhere, because your mind won't change. It won't have suggested to it that there is a means of change. So these symbols, they've been around for hundreds, if not thousands of years, and they're skewed to lead people to certain conclusions. And all I'm doing is just bringing out those conclusions. I'm not inventing this stuff. It was there to begin with. I'm just pointing it out. At the same way it was pointed out to me.
I really like what you just said about symbols being used to suggest to the mind that there's something else. It's just really interesting that the symbols are a product of the mind, and yet they somehow, if digested properly over time, can lead the mind out of its own constraints.
Yes, that's what you said in the previous video about the twilight language. That's the function of the twilight language.
Yeah.
It's a means of delivery.
Right. And it's fluid. It's not concretized. We can't, just like at the beginning of this video here, when we, you were dismissing this notion of the Tzimtzum as a historical event that functions as a proto Big Bang. Like, no, it's this, it doesn't really exist. It's just a symbol method that has a function to help us realize what it's pointing to.
Well, this is the problem, is that these symbols were handed to practitioners and generations of practitioners from those with gnosis, with realization. But practitioners who receive these symbols in future generations, as centuries go by, can make mistakes and reify things that were never intended to be reified and perpetuate those mistakes. So if someone were to see, for example, the symbol of the circle of the Tzimtzum in the vacated space and the Kav, the light being drawn into the vacated space, they want to turn that into a reductionistic model of a proto-history because their mind wants one. They're going to see that, right? If you want a linear explanation for your situation, you're going to make one. If somebody hands you this, you'll make one out of that.
Or if you haven't considered that there's any other way, that you're just resting on your laurels, your conceptual laurels, and saying, well, of course there's a linear history. What else could there be?
You know, there was a book written on the Tzimtzum within the past, I don't know, 5 years or so, and I'm not going to mention it because I don't want to get down on this guy who wrote it, but it was a Jewish guy who wrote a book on Jewish Kabbalah, and he pretty much came out and said, look, we're grown-ups now. We can apply the laws of physics to what we're doing. The Tzimtzum is a description of the Big Bang. He flat out said it. And no, it isn't. No, it isn't, because your world, the mechanics of your world and the physics of your world are irrelevant to my concerns. I am not looking to address them with these symbols. I have other concerns as a mystic, as a contemplative. So obviously his needs are very different from my own to make such an assertion. I don't even need to comment on what he said to say that it's wrong. We're just simply not speaking the same language anymore. We're just using the same symbols.
Right. Well, if someone's approaching it from that angle, I mean, you could say that they're concerned with measuring phenomena, and we're simply not. We're doing something else entirely.
Well, how much more linear can you get than to say there was this dot and the dot expanded and then the expansion opened up and then the expansion collapsed on itself?
Yeah, exactly. Right.
There was this dot. There was you think there was a dot, a point? Well, first of all, the first mistake that they're going to make is there was this point.
There was.
That like a point that appeared out of nothing.
There was a thing that happened. Yeah.
Well, if you say there was a point that appeared out of nothing, automatically you're dividing reality between the point and the nothing.
Yeah, right. There was a thing and there was not a thing, and there's these two things, or there's a thing. Yeah, it's just a mess, right? I mean, this is the mistake at Ketter that we keep coming back to. It's this point at which you either make the mistake or you unmake the mistake.
The great 13th century French mystic Marguerite Porete says this great thing in her book, the Mirror of Simple Souls. She says, "Thingness is the heart's great sorrow."
I love that line.
Yeah, it's the ultimate, because thingness, or reification, if you want to call it that, it either makes these symbols do their job or prevents these symbols from doing their job. And their job is the unmaking of that very impulse to reification. That's the only impulse that we're talking about here. We're not adding anything. If you take away the habit of reification, reality as itself simply presents its essential nature, unbounded and unmasked, naked. It's perfect as it is. We don't need to change it. We just need to stop doing something that we're doing.
Yeah, and it seems to be the hardest thing in the world to stop doing.